quickly.
How dare you? You made a joke about our jokes.
Nice to see you
Good
again.
to see you.
Yeah.
So what you baking today, Jeffrey?
Today, I'm going to make a 5-seed yeasted bread. We'll talk about variations. These were baked at my house earlier this week, and I froze them and thawed them for the occasion. And what about you, Gesine? What are you making?
I lied last week.
She says with a smile.
I totally lied. I said I was going to make Mandelhörnchen. I'm going to do that next week because I realized so many people had asked about pie dough.
Yum.
So there is this, I feel like a slight relation between bread trouble and pie dough trouble. People have them. They have the trouble. So I thought because everyone's baking at home, I will do pie dough this week and get people making tons of pies, and we'll do Mandelhörnchen next week.
Sounds great.
Yeah.
What kind of pie?
I'm gonna do cherry pie.
Yummy.
This one is so happy. It showed its cherry little juices everywhere, which I love. But I have some tricks, not just for the dough, but for actually making beautiful lattice, getting them to taste wonderfully, but also look great. So tons of fun little tricks.
You know, the more I get to know you, the more I feel like there's one thing that we have in common, and that is that we don't believe in secrets, that we're really willing to share.
No secrets. I think that culturally now there's so much about posting these gorgeous things and getting praise for it, which is lovely, but without sharing exactly how it all went down. Sometimes there are tricks that you can make things better, and sometimes it's simply that they cheated, that it's inedible. So I like to say, you know, like some macarons are made from a mix. Something, you know, there are things that people do that they might not be sharing with you. But if there are usable, good things that I think will make people's baking life better, I'd like to share it.
Oh, absolutely. The main reason I don't like secrets is because, first of all, they're silly. And second of all, if I'm holding a secret, then I can't have a dialogue.
Right. Exactly.
Right? And what's nicer than sharing in the world of baking? So
and that's what we're doing.
I'm so glad that we enjoy the same thing. Good.
Yes. Okay, let's do some bread.
All right, we're going to start with some bread. So as we've done in prior sessions, a lot of the bread activity is going to be kind of reverse chronology. So here's finished loaves. Here's risen loaves that I mixed this morning. In a little while, we will be mixing this dough.
But the process started last night for you,
The process started last night when I made a soaker with a bunch of different grains and made a pâte fermentée. And we'll talk about both of those things as we get into it. But here's the nicely risen loaves.
So Ray, can you show Jeffrey touching them so people can get a sense of what that looks like when he touches it?
Right.
And what are you feeling?
Well, what am I feeling? I'm trying to ascertain the inner lightness. So if you think about historically, doctors didn't have MRIs and X-rays. They figured out what was going on your insides by palpating your outsides.
Yes, and putting
so
leeches
that's what
on
I'm
you.
trying to do here. Is I'm trying to get a sense of the inner lightness. And this seems fine. This seems a little bit young, but it's going to go in now anyway.
Yeah. Okay.
So I'll be cutting the oval loaf with a straight blade, this one. This is a curved one, which is very useful if you're trying to get that beautiful flap of
that ear.
The ear, the green, right? And today I'm not going to use this because I'm going to cut the oval loaf with a straight blade. You can get by with just one of these and curve it as you need to. That's fine. I've always just kept two.
And I like your little film carrying case.
It's
your safety
nice
case.
And compact. Yep. So again, we won't use the curved one today.
What is film? And I know that a lot of people are making, obviously, bread right now, and this is one of the things that I have heard gives people trouble, is scoring the bread. And you are going to fix them up.
Okay, let's see what we can do. So we've got in this oven, which is at about 470 degrees, 3 cast iron vessels, and we're going to bake in the cast iron. I'd like to stress too that one of the things that I've been trying to relay to people during these sessions is that they don't have to spend piles of money on all kinds of different things to bake well. Basically, you need one of these in a bowl, and if you don't have a pizza stone or cast iron, you bake on a sheet pan.
Or Dutch oven. Most people have a Dutch oven. It just...
Right.
Yeah.
So anyway, but don't feel like you can't bake because it's going to cost you too much. If I bake the bread on a sheet pan with no steam, it's not going to look as good,
Right.
but it's going to be as nutritional.
It's going to taste fantastic.
And it's going to taste fantastic.
What can I get for you first?
You can get one of the round cast irons.
Okay, I will take this out. Lid. Touch that.
I'm actually going to cut these breads with the scissors.
Okay.
Let's see. Are you going to have to pull the other one out too to get this one back in?
Yeah.
Okay. So scissors is vertical. It's not angled. The leading edge of the scissors is going to be right in the center, and I'm going to snip and walk forward. Do that 2 more times. Okay. Now we go here. You're going to put the lid on? Or you want
I'll
me
put
to?
the lid on, then I'll bring the other one out, then I'll load this one.
All right. There's that.
Beautiful. Lid is on. Next round,
Yep.
I'm just going to sacrifice this bench. Do that here. Lid here.
Okay. I like this one because it serves as a skillet or more of a kind of soup pot, but you can also just slide it easily.
Yeah, that's the
onto
lid, but it's kind of this perfect situation. Okay, now I'm going to get the
big
monster.
And that weighs 26 pounds, so.
Oh my goodness.
Isn't it crazy?
Oh my goodness. I can do it.
So this I just bought. This is the first loaf I baked in this big cast iron. You want me to put it in?
You've got muscles, but I'm going to take the lid off. Oh, that isn't as hard as I thought it would be.
All right, so I'm going to cut with a vertical blade.
And what kind of pressure, like how deeply are you scoring? Because this is where I think people go wrong. They get very timid.
Yeah, I'm scoring. I'm almost letting the weight of the blade with very, very little exertion on my part.
And what
do the
angle
scoring.
would you say that you
For
were
this one,
holding
it's
it?
perpendicular to the loaf.
Just perfect. Okay, great.
For this one, I'm trying to have evenness between each slice, and I'm trying to have the same depth. This looks like a little rip on the surface. That's probably I was too rough on it when I was shaping it. Okay, these will bake for roughly 35 to 40 minutes.
This is my workout for the day.
Yeah. There.
Is that on evenly?
So those cast irons, they create an environment that's lots of radiant heat coming off that iron that's so close, and it's very hot iron, and the bread self-steams. So it does save that step of what a lot of people do of boiling some water in a cast iron and then baking on a pizza stone. So these are enclosed.
But what the great thing about them both is they weren't sold to you as for bread baking. They are
Right.
for usually for camping, and so you can use kind of these slightly cheaper things because they're not priced up because they're for bread.
And they're
for camping.
multi-purpose.
They're multi-purpose, and they
Right.
work incredibly well.
They work incredibly well.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we're loaded. So next you're going to be doing some pre-shaping.
I'm going to divide this ripe dough that Gesine mixed, which I put right here. Let me get this out of the way. So I
And if
don't
you're
hurt
wondering
myself.
why we covered them, so they're on this very hot surface, and this is the ingredient list that we have up. So we covered them because that creates a steam environment that you can't easily create in a home oven, creating a wonderful crust and texture. So that's the ingredient list, and next Jeffrey's going to be pre-shaping a dough that I made. I did the pre-soak that you'll see the ingredients for, and the pâte fermentée I made last night as well, and then I mixed it today, a few hours before we started, and the cling wrap is really excited about it.
How long do those cast irons preheat?
What I do is when I preheat the oven, I put the cast iron in. So this has been preheating for about 45 minutes. So you do want to have the lid in there too. I keep it enclosed with the bottom and the top so that the second you put the lid on, it's hot and it creates that steam environment. So this is interesting. We've made some doughs that haven't been as highly hydrated as this one.
That's right.
And are there any techniques for handling a higher hydration dough that our bakers should know about?
We're going to go over a very good technique when we mix it.
And that's one of the things that if you start researching bread, you'll see percentage and hydration, and that can be very confusing if you're just starting out. And that just means the percentage per water compared to the amount of flour. So higher hydration doughs are just going to be a little harder to work with, only because they're a little more loosey-goosey.
Wait, that one's 825.
So what are your weights there?
This is, these are each about 815 grams.
And you're going to make 3 loaves or 2?
2 loaves.
2 loaves, good. That's what I did. And Jeffrey, we have been eating this bread. I made it on Tuesday. We ate both loaves we ate 1 loaf that day I baked off, and then the second loaf the second day.
Remember, Gesine,
What
I said about bread during week 2. It rises in the yeast and it settles in the waist.
In the ways it does. But hey, it has the nice thing about this one, it has all those beautiful seeds in it. It has some rye.
Yeah, I know.
It feels very wholesome, but it's also incredibly tender and delicious.
And it's light textured.
Yeah, it has such a great crumb. I love this bread.
Yeah. Okay, so here we have kind of random shapes. Yes, you could turn this into a final shape right now, but arguably you're better off if you pre-shape it. And to do that, I'm just going to pat it a couple times in case there's any really big air bubbles in there, because if they remain in there, you'll have overly large bubbles when you cut into your loaf, which would be a little bit of a defect. So the way I look at it, if you could hide a mouse in it, the bubble's too big.
A mouse?
Yeah. So that's all it takes. We're not trying to drive all the gas out, just a little bit. Now I'm going to fold it in half away from me. The seam is horizontal. I'm going to pick it up so the seam is now vertical, and I'm going to lay it on its tailbone and flop it over. And just do that 3 or 4 times. There we have it.
It's beautiful. Look at all those wonderful seeds. So those are sunflower seeds if you didn't look at the ingredient list. Sunflower and flax.
Flax, oats.
Oats.
There's rye flour and there's white flour.
So if someone can't find all of the seeds, any of the seeds, they can make this without any of the pre-soak, right?
You can do pumpkin seeds.
Yeah.
You can do anything you want. Another thing, you can dramatically change the flavor of the bread simply by, instead of soaking the sunflower seeds, if you toast them and add them, it gives you a completely different taste.
Yeah.
Okay, so this will stay here for a few minutes. I'll do the other one. And one thing, I hope it's okay with our viewers, I try to do things slowly, but then I also try to do it a little bit more at kind of work speed or closer to work speed. Not that I'm doing it in order to show up, but what I'm trying to do is open a little door and say, this is how you do the pre-shaping, but then open another door, which is, this is more of a baker's method of doing it.
Right.
So you might want to aspire towards that.
That's the reality.
Yeah.
And so how much, and also it's important that you have a decent amount of flour on so that you're not tearing the bread as well.
You need to have as little as possible so you don't tear the bread.
Right.
Right? Too much and you're probably going to incorporate raw flour into the dough. That's something you want to avoid.
So I have a question. When you have a higher hydration dough, is it going to absorb more flour if you add too much to the bench? Does that make sense? Because it feels very thirsty because it is so tacky that it just wants to absorb more flour. And I feel like people can tend to put too much down because it is a little tacky.
Yeah, and if you do, again, so if I had flour like this,
Yeah.
and then I shaped it and incorporated the raw flour, that flour is not going to hydrate. So in other words, when you cut your loaf after the bake, you're going to see these kind of unattractive grayish streaks of unhydrated
And
flour.
that is not tasty either.
Nope. Okay, what are you doing?
I am making my lattice right now, but I figure that you can do your initial mix while I do this,
Okay.
and then we can go on to me making dough and making a lattice.
All right, so we're going to do the initial mix. How
You're
much
gonna do the
time
initial-
are you going to need?
I'd say like 15 minutes,
No, I mean, how much time can I take before you have to start?
however much you need.
Okay. So we're going to mix the 5 seed. We're going to do it with a technique that is very effective, not just in professional bakeries, but also for home bakers. It's quite effective. It's called bassinage, which is another one of those fancy words.
Yeah.
And it just means it's a bath, basically,
Yeah.
bassin. It's also known as double hydration in English. And the technique for doing it is quite simple. You hold back roughly 10% of the final dough water, and that means you'll be mixing the dough in a slightly drier environment. It's much easier to develop gluten in a drier environment, so you'll be able to develop your dough nicely. And then once you've got it where you want it, you dribble in that last 10% of the water so that you bring your hydration up to the desired level.
Right. So in this case, it's 324 grams of water.
Right, so I'm doing 295 grams right now.
So that's what you're going to start with and hold back the rest.
But first I want to show you the other components. So this is the pâte fermentée, which is another one of those $2 words that simply means fermented dough or old dough. And this was the little premix that I made yesterday. And it's been around now for almost 20 hours. You can see a lot of aeration internally.
And so the idea of a pâte fermentée, isn't it that, so back in the olden days, when they would make bread, they would hold back some of the dough
Yeah.
for the next day's mix.
Yeah.
So this is essentially, so it has salt in it. So that's
That slows it down.
That slows it down.
Yep.
But so people have asked, like, I have heard that in the past that you could use some of the dough from an earlier bake for the next day, and that's theoretically what this is.
Yes, the only difference, and it's a significant difference, is that I used a mere speck of yeast in
Yeah.
here. And if you're taking dough to hold back for the next bake from a fully yeasted batch of bread, then you can't just leave it at room temperature. This has been at cool room temperature for about 20 hours, but if it were a fully yeasted bread, it would be super overaged after 20 hours. So
Yeah.
if you're doing that, you're gonna maybe leave it out for an hour and then refrigerate it till the next day.
But the theory is similar.
Yep. This will provide flavor. It's fermented dough, so there's more fermentation flavor. It'll provide a little more structure to the dough because there's a slight acidity. It's much more pronounced when you make a sourdough. The acidity is really going to help with the dough structure. With the pâte fermentée, it's not as dramatic, but there is a little bit more dough structure. And another benefit is the time factor. It's going to require less time to mature the dough because you're already instantly adding all kinds of flavor into the dough through the pâte fermentée. Here's the soaked grains. When I put the water in them yesterday evening, it's sloshed around. It looked like a soup, and you can see that now there's not a trace of water left. So
Is that included in the total hydration of
yes,
the dough?
absolutely is. So I'm going to put 295 grams of water initially, and then after the mix is done, we'll put in the rest.
And what kind of, you're using an instant yeast that can go
Yep.
straight in. You don't have to
You don't have to
bloom
hydrate it. No.
hydrate it beforehand. So that's called instant yeast. And people still are confused about the different kinds of yeast. Look for instant yeast. Don't use rapid rise. That's not going to be the right kind of yeast for this. But now they're
That's
using
200.
quick rise, not the rapid rise. They're making the granules small enough that you can incorporate it straight into the flour as well. Or so I have heard. That's the rumor on the bread street.
One thing you'll want to do if you're mixing in a stand mixer like this one is always have your liquid ingredients first. If you started with flour, because of the mechanics of the bowl design and the hook design, you would wind up, you could mix it for 20 minutes, and when you take the dough out, there would still be flour on the bottom. So
Yeah.
you always start with the liquid. So I
I'm
need
scooching
95
behind
more.
you, Jeffrey. So in the past, we have made no fold French bread. We've made sourdough. We've made oat bread. We've made some amazing things. Now, how would you
braids.
describe the difference of this bread compared to, say, the the no knead bread?
The no knead bread, well, that's 100% white. The
Right.
no knead bread. I think, you know, they're siblings in a sense. This one's more complex because of the extra grains and things.
Yeah.
They're both fun.
And then you just have to remember that you have to do these things the night before, and that you have to like set your calendar
Yeah.
for how you're going to be making the bread, because it does make a difference. So if somebody didn't do this, if they wanted to do this in a day, could they start it in the morning and do kind of get this in the oven in the
you
early evening?
You might want to start with hot water in the soaked
In the soaker?
ingredients.
Yeah.
All right, so everything is in now. I'm going to mix this only until the dough comes together in a rough, shaggy ball. And then I'm going to turn the mixer off. And during the subsequent rest period, gluten bonds will be developing. And it's going to mean when we go to finish the mix, it'll require less time in mixing. So this is a great technique for home mixing.
And it's in including together the water and the flour. That's when the gluten starts getting produced. And
Yeah, what happens is even when the mixer is off,
Right.
without mechanical agitation, the gluten bonds will be developing.
Yeah. And that's why a lot of people are confused, though, about now there's so many gluten-free flours, and they see the word flour and they assume that they could just swap out one for the other. And I think that's incredibly frustrating, because you cannot, because they don't produce gluten
Okay.
in breads. You're going to get something crumbly that doesn't hold together, because that gluten creates so much of that wonderful structure and texture.
That's right. Let's see, have we been in 20 minutes yet?
We have been in 25 minutes.
Let's pull the lids.
We have been in, let me see, well, let's, it needs a little more.
Yeah, it does.
You get back on. Get back on, sir. I can do it. There we go. Hey, I'm gonna give this 10 more minutes.
Okay.
No, we're still mixing.
Mix it.
Go get in that mixer, Ray Ray. I'm being bossy. So this is the initial mix. So when I made this dough this morning, I did it at low speed for those 3 minutes. And then I turned up the speed to about medium for 5 minutes. And what's amazing is in that time how differently the dough looks. But this is with a little less water added than I added everything in
You did,
today.
yeah.
I did.
If you're mixing by hand, that bassonage technique can be really, really, really effective
Right.
if it's a wet dough.
If it's a very wet dough, because that can be really tough to mix by hand with a wet dough. It's also when the bowl scraper is kind of a wonderful thing. And someone asked, is this sourdough? This is not sourdough.
No, but I'd like to make one point. Intentionally, it's not sourdough because, again, you know, I'm assuming that a lot of people who are watching our program are relatively new to baking. And sourdough is maybe a higher rung on the ladder in general. And I don't want anybody to feel like they're being left in the dust because they're new to baking and they don't quite get the whole sourdough thing, or they can't maintain it on a regular basis. So, but those of you who do have a sourdough that's viable, you can simply take this formula And instead of taking 20 or 25%, what is it, of the flour and putting it in a pâte fermentée, take 20 or 25% of the flour, make a sourdough.
Make a sourdough.
And don't use any yeast.
Yeah.
Okay, this is ready now for its off phase. You can see it's quite shaggy. It just shreds apart in my hand. With
And
no
just sitting there, it
resistance.
will continue developing.
Yep, yep.
And if these words, just the things we're saying like pâte fermentée, hydration, if they're confusing, just pretend we didn't even say them. Look at those recipes and just kind of ignore the words that you don't understand and know that you can make this without that particular knowledge, just that you have to do it to make the bread good. And you can without understanding everything, because it can be very confusing, but it's kind of nice that when you start getting introduced to the language of these things, at first you're like, it is a foreign language. It's like speaking another language entirely. But if you do it more and more, and the more you read, these things will keep coming up and they'll become very familiar to you. So don't let this kind of put you off. Just know that, look at the recipe. If the words are confusing, don't worry about them. It's just fancy ways of saying, you can do this too.
Yeah.
You can totally do it. And now what I'm going to do, easy as pie is such a misnomer because so many people have trouble with pie dough. And I know I said I was going to make Mandelhörnchen, which are my little almond horns. I kept thinking, people keep asking about pie dough. And I wanted to show you how I make pie dough. And no matter what your recipe is, this translates to every pie dough recipe, what I'm going to do to make sure that it's not tough, it's not crumbly, so that it's tender and flaky. When I teach in my school, I do a different ratio. I have a really high butter ratio to flour. It's equal. So if I have 12 ounces of flour, I have 12 ounces of butter, which is lethal and delicious. So this is going to be a little less. This is kind of a very classic American pie crust, so it's going to combine both a bit of shortening and butter. And in here I already have my flour. This is all-purpose unbleached flour and some salt. It's already in there. And what's important in this case is that the flour, being unbleached, also has a relatively high gluten percentage. It's 11.7. You don't have to know this. I'm just saying that because I'm going to be doing a few things that if you produce too much gluten in a pie dough, it becomes tough. So there are a few things that you do to make sure that it's tender. The first thing I do, I'm putting in my shortening, which is about 1/4 cup, and I put it in small pieces. I usually freeze it beforehand, and this is Crisco. But some shortenings, if you freeze them, they get incredibly hard. But Crisco is still a little, I always use a German word, weich. It's still a little soft even when you freeze it.
Is the flour cold?
The flour's cold. Not so much as it was because it's pretty warm in here right now because the oven's been on. But I put in the shortening first, and what I do is I use the tips of my fingers to incorporate that shortening, which it's 100% fat, has no water in it. So when I'm doing this, I'm not going to be producing any gluten because there's no water around to do that. But what I am doing is coating some of that flour in the fat, so it's encapsulating it. And when you do that, I call that fat Spanx, literally. You are putting this little corset around the flour so that when you add the water, some of that flour is going to be coated in like its little scuba suit. So it's
the
going to be
gluten won't
protected. So
develop,
the gluten won't
Yep.
develop. That's why I love using this flour, because it is this wonderful relationship between structure and tenderness. If you coat enough of it in that lovely tender fat, then the gluten that you do produce is going to be effective. It's going to give you structure instead of being overly glutened and tough. So once I do that, and look at this, it's going to look like a sandy beach. You can tell that it's now looking rough.
Could you use a mixer?
I wouldn't use a mixer because then you tend to overheat everything, and you will end up creating a dough rather than what I like to consider kind of a lovely shaggy mess in the beginning. And that's one of the things that is so frustrating for many people when they start doing pie dough. They want it to look like dough instantaneously. So what they'll do is that you'll overwork it, you'll knead it, and then you'll add too much water because you want it to look perfect very quickly.
So you said your standard pie crust that you teach is 100% fat, and this is less, but what's the percentage in this one?
So in this case, it's about 100, so it's 197 grams of flour to about 180 some of fats.
Oh, so it's pretty close to
It's pretty
100.
close.
Yeah.
It's pretty close.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, 297 flour.
297.
I'm
okay.
lying.
So it's about 70%.
Yes.
Somewhere in there.
He's doing math. I knew it was less.
And what percentage of the fat is butter?
In this case, it is about, let me see what the recipe says. In this case, it's 46 grams of shortening and 142 of butter. And in this case, you can use just regular old grocery store butter. I always use unsalted because I already put salt in the flour, so I know exactly. And I'm using a higher fat percentage butter. You don't have to, but I had it, and it's delicious. And it's very elastic. So what I'm doing right now, in class, this is what I explain. When you start dealing with the butter, you're no longer, it's a metamorphosis, you're no longer human. You can't do this anymore. You have to become a lobster. You can only do this. And the reason I say that is the second you start doing this, and you do it unconsciously, even if you think, I'm a lobster, you're gonna start doing this. I don't want you kneading. All I want you to do is to coat that butter in some of that flour and just flatten it. And what you're doing is you're creating these sheets of butter within this structure that will almost act like lamination, right? So you're gonna have these, and they'll start coming apart when you have this kind of very high fat content butter.
That's fascinating.
It's very plastic.
I've been making good pie dough for over 40 years. I've never once seen this technique. Where did you learn this?
Based on how I like pies, and that I like them incredibly flaky and tender.
So you came up with this method?
So I came up with this method based on kind of French rough puff pastry on Blitz puff. And it's because I really love that texture so much. But I also like the tender, and I understand how difficult it is for people to make a pie dough that isn't crumbly and tough. And it's because it's just the treatment of everything, and it's the oversaturation of the dough too. So if you look at this now, you'll see these big chunks of butter. Now, that said, you can use a pastry blender which looks like this that will give you much smaller pieces, almost pea-sized pieces of butter. That's totally fine. It will be less flaky, but just as tender. This creates just a very flaky dough. And I do, because this is a very plastic butter, it does stay together really well. I will make slightly smaller pieces, about quarter-sized. And now what I do is I create a little real estate. I don't want it all in one pile in the middle of the bowl. This is a relatively big bowl, and you'll see why I use a big bowl in a second. And to this I have, the recipe doesn't call for it, but I always put a little lemon juice in there for extensibility of the dough, making it easier to roll out. But also, if you store this in the refrigerator for a while, it helps stop it from oxidizing, because it can get gray and weird. And I don't like gray and weird, so a little lemon juice won't hurt. And about 10 tablespoons of water. If you're using all-purpose, if you're using pastry flour, you'd use a little less water. And because I've been doing this dough a few times, okay, that's good. I know that I successfully have added all of it. But I would suggest at home that you start only adding 9 tablespoons at first. And I'll show you how I add the water. When I add it, I have this expanse of butter, fat, and flour, and I don't have it in a pile. I kind of put it all around, and then I gently, and remember, I'm still a lobster right now. I'm no longer human. Keep that in your head when you do this. I'm going to take a spoon first, and then I'm literally going to toss everything around. I'm not stirring. All I'm trying to do is distribute that dry mess and the water. You can also use a bowl scraper, is great for this, because what you can do with the bowl scrapers as you're doing it is that you can scrape the bottom of the bowl. Ta-da! But you can slice through any pockets of moisture without producing too much gluten. So you're kind of acting like in the old school way when you do the 2 knives together.
So what would happen if you used 100% butter and no shortening?
Oh, you could absolutely do that. It would just be a flakier pie crust. So if you would rather just use 100% butter, feel free to do that. Make sure that the butter is very cold, and that high-fat butter, it doesn't get softer sooner, it just is much more pliable at a cold temperature. And that's why I love to use it, and it's incredibly tasty. It's fantastic. So now, still a lobster, but I call this windshield wipers. And you'll see why. So I don't want to knead this. Remember, I can only do this. I can't bend my fingers. I pick up huge handfuls of this really strange, shaggy mess, And with my thumbs, I'm a windshield wiper, and all I'm doing, I'm not really pressing, I'm just breaking apart. I'm going to take off those lids.
Oh, they can stay another minute.
Okay.
I want to watch you.
So I'm just breaking apart those big clumps of moisture, and you can still see some of that dry mixture there. If I shake my hand, you can see it kind of rumbling off. So when I'm doing this too, I'm incorporating some of that dry mixture into the wet mixture that I'm breaking apart. And you might look at this right now and go, oh, you're going to need more water, and this is the problem.
That's the problem. That's right.
This is the big problem. I'm looking at this, I'm like, this is fully hydrated. I'm also feeling it, so I know. If this were a little cooler, even better. I don't want to touch this too much because I don't want to heat it up too much. And if you've got very hot hands, and you know who you are, do this even faster. Some people have like extraordinarily hot hands and they have to work very quickly.
Well, okay, so what if I were doing this, even if I don't have extraordinarily hot hands, what if I were doing this in August in my kitchen? Could I at this point refrigerate it and
yes,
finish
and
it?
I would recommend refrigerating it at this point.
Okay.
Because the next step is we're going to manipulate it even more. We're never kneading it, but you are no longer a lobster now because you're going to have to make a fist, or you can use the palms of your hand. I always say if you've got very hairy knuckles, use your palms. But yeah, you're
What
fine
if you have
either way.
hairy palms?
If you have hairy palms, then you should be going to a doctor. And so what? Or a priest. And now I'm doing the same thing as I did before. I'm giving myself some real estate. I don't want it clumped in a pile. I'm going to use my
Look out behind you.
knuckles, and I'm going to press and smear. And this is called, in the French, fraisage. You don't need to know that. Think smear. And what I'm doing is I'm compressing the dough, and this is kind of a proof that when you compact it, it's holding together as a dough. So that's one thing it's showing you, is that it is indeed a dough. You don't need to add more water. But what it's also doing is incorporating that butter into essentially sheets of butter to make it incredibly flaky. So I do one pass, and then I turn it over. And I turn it over because look at all that dry stuff. I want this to be incorporated too. So I get it all together again. And again, I'm not kneading this. I'm not overworking it, but I'm just pressing it so that all these bits are incorporated, and so that I have a cohesive dough. So I've done that again. You can still see those great bits of butter. And I'm going to work really fast because I can feel heat on my back. I'm going to turn this over once more. Boop. And you have to make those noises for this to work. So you see it's a little dry there. So what I'll do is I'll just fold it over. And a lot of people at this point would add more water. I can feel it. It's all staying together. But I'm going to put this out onto my bench in a second. So before I do that, I'm going to compress it a little more into a nice little puck. And I'm going to lightly dust. Don't pile, just get a nice little dusting on there. Turning this over, and I'm going to put a little bit on my pin, a little here. And if you have jumpers like this is when you're no longer the lobster, so you can bend your fingers and make sure that they're incorporated. And I'm going to roll this out quickly into about a 12 by 8 rectangle. And when this happens, this little grubby stuff, this is another reason why the bowl scraper is such a lovely thing. You don't ruin your pen. You just use that to clean it up. So about 12 by 8. And it's, for some people, they're like, this doesn't look right. It's right. You can see these glorious bits of butter. And then you take either your bowl scraper or your bench scraper, and you make a single or letter fold to create so much more flaky layered structure. And then I call this my pie fold. Fold it in half again. It's a little warm here, so if it were a little cooler, it wouldn't look so wet. But now I neaten it up by going boop, boop. Now I cover it up and let it rest for about 20 minutes in the refrigerator, or 30 minutes, depending on how. This is a little warm because it's warm right behind me. And then I'm ready to use it. So this is a double crusted dough. I keep it like this. I don't put it into 2 discs because then I'd just be manipulating it too much. And then I roll it out again. I just cut it in half and I roll it into whatever shape I need.
So here we have like the fold of the book.
Yes.
So when you roll it out, are you going to have the fold?
When I
Go
cut
ahead.
it, yeah, I cut it in half like this and I just roll from there. So
Okay.
it's, when I cut, I always give each piece, I call these the alligator teeth because it's a little gnarly, and it's smooth side, so I cut it in half like that. And then I'll have little rectangles that I'll roll out from there. So I'm going to cover this up, and in the magic of our little space here, I will show you what I have already done. I have created lattice strips already using half of the dough. And what I did is I rolled it out to about 17 by little over 9 inches. And I cut out 4 about 1.5 inch pieces and about 12 half-inch pieces. So 4 1.5 inch pieces, 12 half-inch pieces. And you're like, why are you doing lattice now? This is how I do lattice. I do it off the pie because it makes everything look better. In this Instagram age, you can make gorgeous things, and sometimes you don't know how the people on the internets did it. This is one way to make perfect looking lattice, is that you don't do it on the pie. You do it with nice and cool pieces. And I put 2 thick pieces there, and then I put 3 in the middle. So this almost makes a plaid. So 3 in the middle, 2 thick. How's that bread doing in there?
It's good.
And then 1 on either side. Now, if you have some pieces, so rolling out a rectangle for some people isn't as easy as it sounds. Sometimes it looks like Florida, sometimes it looks like Texas. So what I always say is that those pieces that are longer are the pieces that you're going to use in the middle of your pie, because they run the expanse of the whole dish, and the shorter pieces you'll put at the end. So this is how I start. Now I'm going to build, this is going to be confusing, but I'm going to build one end first. So I'll put this here. So I'm not manipulating these strips too much, pulling them back too much. So I'll start here, and I'll just finish this end up. And I'll put a little strip there. I feel like, you know, when we were saying, when you were doing the challah, sometimes you can't go slowly because then you lose your rhythm. I feel that way about weaving. If you think too much, you might lose your way. But the whole purpose here is that we are weaving. You're not just setting the pieces one on top of the other. So what I look at is I look to see which pieces are covered. And by covered, I mean this piece right here is covered, this is covered, and this is covered. And there's another one too. So what I'll do is I'll pull that back because it wants some limelight of its own. It wants to be seen. So I pull that back. And I'm going to follow the pattern that I've created already, going in the other direction. So I'm covering that up. And I'll cover that. And always remember to put your pieces back before you start again.
You had pulled those out of that box, but would you be better off having them coming straight from refrigeration?
Well, I had a little trick. I have little ice packs in that box.
So at home, you'd want to come
At home,
right
you'd
from
want it
refrigeration.
from the refrigerator. And what I do is I usually have a sacrifice piece like this along with it. And what I'll do is I'll bend it.
Yeah.
If it breaks
Yeah,
because that
it's
butter
too
too is cold,
Yeah.
I won't start yet. So it'll be my test piece to see if it's malleable. You don't want it so warm that as you start folding them over, they start
Stretch.
they start stretching and they lose their shape. So right now, if you want to touch this, it's still nice and cool. So I'm doing 3 thin pieces. So again, this is covered, this is covered, this is covered, this is covered. And I also have a little tutorial online if you want to kind of pause. And this will live online as well, and we'll put up the recipe. But if you want to just look it up on the site now, it's the classic double crusted pie. So now I'm going to finish everything up. You'll see what I mean by plaid in 1 second. Boop. And at the beginning, sometimes it's very confusing. You do not have to do this. You can have strips all of the same size, just as long as you weave them to get that very lovely effect of a basket. And so now we have that little plaid effect. And from here, I will refrigerate this.
Isn't that pretty?
And I will land it straight on the pie like this and trim. The reason I do this is that it's totally fine to lattice on top of a pie, but as you're doing it, usually the berries are very juicy.
Sure.
They will add moisture to the dough. So you'll stain the dough, first of all. And the other thing is, in adding the moisture, you will distend that dough.
Yep.
You will make it
Yep.
misshapen. This way you can make it look great, put it on the pie, and it'll bake up very evenly. And keeping it cold really goes a long way in making sure that all your beautiful cuts stay perfect.
Exactly.
Just have that sacrificial piece of dough so you can bend it back and forth out of the refrigerator to make sure that it's not too hard, because that butter does stiffen and can crack. And also make sure that it's still very cool so that when you start doing that, you don't start misshaping the dough. And now you can continue, Jeffrey.
Okay. One more question.
Yes,
Could you
please.
take it to that point and freeze it?
You could freeze it. What's important is that I usually freeze it for a few minutes before I land it on the pie. You don't want it so cold that when you trim it, that it shatters.
But could you freeze it for a week and then?
Oh, yeah. You
And
could
then
totally freeze it.
refrigerate it overnight or something?
Yes, this dough in general is great for freezing.
Mm-hmm.
And then usually what I'll do is the night before I'll put it in the fridge to thaw. And you would do the same with this. You would put this in the fridge to thaw. And then I'll show you how to land it on the pie. It's really fun. It's
Cool.
exciting. And you always want an audience when you do it. So you can, you need that gratification of your genius. So now you've done the pre-shape. You're on
Yes.
to the final shape.
We also have some 90-gram rolls that I divided when I got here. So we'll do a few rolls too. The dough is moderately wet, so I'm being fairly liberal. One of the things that's very distressing is when you empty your banneton, your bread form, and the dough sticks to it.
So the banneton, yeah, that bread form is called a banneton, or Brotform,
Yeah,
as the Germans
Brotform,
would call
yeah.
it.
Okay, that should do. So round loaf, basically you start the same way we did for the pre-shaping, but you're just more emphatic. Now it's not a pre-shape, it's a final shape. So let's see what we got.
A few more minutes.
Yeah, we want a crust
5?
you can trust.
5?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
So when you're done with the final shaping, the bread should be round, seamless, without any rips on it. If I needed to, I would just stop part way and dry my hands so that I'm not ripping the dough due to wet hands, okay? Another thing that is a good precaution, since the dough is moderately moist, is just to ensure that it's dry everywhere before you put it in the basket. Okay? The oval loaf, we did one a couple of weeks ago. 1, 2, 3. And now the thumbs go here, and I just roll and push like this. My fingers are not part of this action. When I get to the bottom, I'll give it a taper. And when I'm satisfied with the length and the symmetry, we'll put it in the basket. So there we have a round and an oval. These will take, I would think, about an hour, hour and a quarter to rise. For the rolls, I brought some sesame seeds. I thought I had another sheet pan there.
I got another sheet pan for you.
Here it is, I found it. So
Same dough,
Wait,
but
wait.
you're making rolls.
now I'm making rolls, and I'm going to cover them in sesame seeds just to get another little flavor out of them. And I'm sorry, I wasn't thinking. I went too fast on those. I'll do. This is the first time we've done rolls? No, we did
No, you did them before,
oat rolls,
yeah.
didn't we? These are 90 grams. Damp cloth. That's the easiest way to do it. It looks like too many seeds, but it really isn't.
They'll only adhere to whatever is damp, so you won't overseed them, right?
Dry hands. These are the seam sides, so they're going down. So I'm going to pick this up and sort of fold it in half, and now I make a kind of cage with my hands, and this all stays on the bench the entire time. And I force it to come together under my hands. So again, that's the seam side, dry hands, flip it over. If it's a big roll, your hands might be out here. This small roll, my hands are more in here. Most of the action is taking place between my thumb, my pinky, and the center of my palm. It's the same as when you're making a loaf. If you have any sense that your hands are feeling tacky, you stop right away and dry your hands, otherwise you'll rip it. So start dry, but you'll notice there's nothing on the bench because I want to get that traction. Oh, I wanted to show you something, Gesine.
Yeah.
I think that's right, we did do rolls because I had mentioned my first time I worked in Germany.
Oh, you did on your chest?
Yeah, we did it like this.
Yes. Oh, show us.
Because we didn't have any bench space.
I'm assuming you were wearing a shirt.
Yeah, we were wearing shirts.
Or were you wearing lederhosen?
We didn't have any bench space, but you get the same results.
I love it.
Yep. Too many rolls and not enough space for them. So there we have it. There's those. Everything's shaped, and now I think the bread's coming out of the oven.
Yes, you get the bread out of the oven. I will get my cherries. We'll do our little dance.
Let's see. Okay, so if it's particularly pale in here, that would be an indication that it's not quite done. That's an indication that it is done. I don't personally put thermometers into loaves of bread. I would find it personally disrespectful, and even more than that, it's entirely inaccurate. Maybe we'll talk about that sometime. So for me, I like a crust you can trust. So I tend to bake to a pretty good rich color. Let's see. Okay, you can see the effect of the scissors. You get this series of little kind of high ridges. And then that big one. Okay,
I love that scoring. That's gorgeous.
It's pretty. I don't like how it happened here. Again, it doesn't affect the nutrition, but there is a measure of vanity among bakers, or at least in my case there is. And so I would look at that and I would say that's a defect right there, but it's not going to worry me that much. I'm still pretty happy with the bread. Okay?
Oh, that sounds good.
There's that sound too.
Oh, Jeffrey, we've been eating this all week, and now I fear we're going to continue eating.
Yeah,
constantly.
see, there's my vanity. Put the bad side away from the camera.
Yeah, it's like when you do a wedding cake and one side doesn't look good, you put it against the wall.
That's right. Can I leave this here?
You can leave that there.
Okay. It's hot, hot, hot. And you turn the oven off, yeah?
That oven's off. My oven's on. I have my oven on at 375. That's how I like to bake my pie. If you are going to blind bake, and by blind bake means some pies require you to bake the bottom crust, either a little or completely through. I do it upside down and at 400. So what I do is I take a similar pie tin and I turn it upside down and bake it like this on a sheet pan with parchment. So gravity's doing that trick instead of the pie weights. And I find that the heat going through is far more effective and even than it is to pile it up with pie weights.
Yeah, sure.
The other thing is that people ask, why do I use these pie tins? Because they are incredibly effective. And if you do not want to blind bake the bottom and actually getting heat to the bottom very quickly, they are so cheap and so thin that they're incredibly great heat conductors, is that you almost get heat at the same time to the bottom as you do on the top. And if you look at very old bakery pie tins, they're very thin metal and they usually have holes on the bottom. And you can find them at some antique marts, but they might have lead in them, so don't get them. The other thing is that you're not going to care if you leave this at someone's house. You're going to care if you leave your gorgeous ceramic pie thing. And this also fits perfectly into those decorative pie tins.
So if I were to bake in a big thick pie tin, Would that affect the flakiness?
It would indeed, because
Yeah.
what happens is that it is so thick you tend to melt the butter
Yep,
instead of
getting
steaming
that
it and getting
instant
that
heat. Yeah.
instant heat. And that is what happens when you see a lot of slumping and a lot of leakage. It's because that heat's not getting to the crust and it is simply melting. And you don't want that to happen. You want that flakiness to, like, you want the butter to stay where it is. And that's high heats, 375, and also using the very effective vessel to bake it. So in here I have about 4 cups of frozen organic cherries. And I like using frozen for a couple of reasons, is because you can get organic more cheaply and you're not going to let it sit in your refrigerator and get moldy.
And frozen fruit tends to be picked when it's ripe.
And when it's ripe, it's usually
because
sweeter.
It can't ship,
Exactly.
so it's higher quality.
It is. I find that you have to add more sugar to a fresh fruit than you do to, unless it's from your own backyard. And what I've done is I have coated it in a mixture of about a tablespoon and a teaspoon of instant clear gel, which is a modified cornstarch, close to a 1/4 cup of sugar, and this is totally up to you, the sugar portion of it, of what your sweetness level it is. Ray likes the sweeter pie. I put a little more sugar in there. And then to that, I'm also going to add a little bit of almond extract because that's a sympathetic flavor. It helps enhance the flavor of the cherries. I add cardamom to blueberry, just a little, and a little almond to this. Boop, put that in there. And I'm a big fan of zest. So I add quite a bit.
It's lemon?
It's lemon zest, and I add about 1 lemon's worth. And I did it ahead of time, so you kind of want to break that up a little and not clump it so much, but I don't mind clumps because I love lemon zest. Orange zest would work well in this as well. But before I load this up in the pan, what I'm going to do is I'm going to dock this just to make the heat a little more even. So this allows the heat to go in and out of the crust more evenly. And then to that, this is my little invention called Crust Dusk. I leave it in a jar, equal amounts of flour and sugar that I will leave it in your pantry, and you put about a teaspoon at the bottom to absorb any errant liquids before the crust has a chance to start to bake. So in this jar, I think I have about a 1/3 cup each of flour and sugar, and then I just mix it up, and then I have it ready for whenever I'm making pie. Now I'm going to add my frozen cherries. Again, this is 4 cups of organic frozen cherries, and you'll notice that that thickening agent just sticks to each one, but there'll be a little left, little dry stuff left. So what I try to do is evenly disperse it so that you don't have one clump of thickening agent. And this will kind of fall, and I flatten it too so that the crust sits neatly on top. Sprinkle this evenly. And you know, in the olden days, they used to put little bits of butter on top of the fruits, which is something I don't do. And you don't have to do, but I suppose that butter lends itself a little more flavor. But there's no real reason behind it that I could think of until one day I realized, I think back in the day when they used tapioca pearls, if there was a bit of tapioca pearl exposed, it would harden in the oven. But by putting that butter on top, it gave a little vessel that would protect it and keep it from becoming this hard morsel. So that's where we're starting. And come stare at this while I get my crust that I put in the freezer really briefly. So I've just had this in there for about 2 minutes so that it's stiff enough. And this is actually a cake spatula. You can do this straight from the back of a, let me make sure it's, okay, watch. This is exciting. Just goes straight on, which I love. And because it's cold enough, you can do little adjustments, like you can move strips if they've gone out of place without losing their shape.
That's beautiful, Gesine.
I love doing this. And it's just fun when people think, oh, it's impossible to do. It's like, nah, it's totally possible to do. It's a fun little trick. It's almost like taking a tablecloth out from under all your cutlery. And now I'm going to trim this just to the inside of the pie, like that. And you have all these extra bits that I leave there because you may need them to make little adornments on the top of the pie. I think it's pretty enough that you really don't need to, but sometimes you find that maybe a piece of lattice isn't as pretty as you'd like it to be. So you put a little, say, a flower on top and pretend that was your intention all along. And I'm going to egg wash this instead of milking it. Because some people like to just put milk on top. But I like the shine of an egg wash. And I also like my things to be a little darker than, you know. I
With
like
like
it to,
98% butter. Oh no, this is only 67% butter.
yes,
Yeah.
you do the math. You do the math. So now I'm just doing it on the inside. See how easily that moves around? Just going to cut it off. Get in there, you sucker. And now I'm going to show you, I'm going to crimp a little. Oh, hey! Oh, flying. So just so that it's literally covering that fruit and giving pretty much an even measure of crust oil. And now I'm going to fold this over all the way around. And you have to make sure that when you do the top crust, the bottom crust, when you fold this over, that you don't want it to be sitting around out and about too long, because it can form a skin, so that when you start folding it and crimping it, it will start to crack. So make sure that you get your bottom crust done relatively quickly before you start crimping it.
I love all the little tips you give. They're so helpful.
It's helpful because people have trouble with pie, but there are tricks that if you don't know them, it can make things very frustrating. But if you do, you're like, ha. So now I'm going to just use my thumb and of my right hand, and then the thumb and index finger of my next one, just to make a very simple crimp. And what this also does, it creates a bit of a dam, because if you see how high that crimp is, if it starts juicing out, it will create a bit of a moat or a bit of a dam, so that it wouldn't be a moat, because then it would just travel right in there. So that if it starts juicing out, that it doesn't go onto the bottom of your oven. So it's high enough that it'll trap it right there.
And do you bake right away, or do you chill it again?
I usually bake right away if everything is still incredibly cold, but right now it's feeling a little warm. So I will chill it so it can relax and won't shrink back too much. This lattice is nice and relaxed because it's been sitting and it's been done. So this won't shrink. It's this right here that could do a little, well, if it shrinks evenly, I really don't mind. And I'm also pressing my thumb against the tin with my right hand so that it stays there.
Yeah.
What I also do is I egg wash just the lattice part and not the edge. Because what can happen, the egg wash also helps browning. It's the edge that browns first. So it tends to brown completely evenly if you just egg wash the top. And you don't miss the shine along here because it's crimping, it's doing its thing. You'll get that shine up here. And then once I egg wash, I will put little bits of, if you want to, you don't have to. And if you find that parts of your crimping aren't up to snuff, you can just lay a little flour over.
Did you study gum paste?
I love gum paste.
This is a calyx to make a rose?
Yes, it is.
With the ball tool.
Yep, and what I do, instead of a ball tool for this, I usually have a chopstick, and I'll make a little center in this and have little leaves just scattered around. So that's for just beauty's sake, or for, say, like right here, this piece of lattice isn't reaching all the way over. No worries, you just put a flower right there, but you have to have the egg wash on top so that it actually sticks.
Yeah.
And then some people like to put a sparkle sugar, a sanding sugar on top. It makes it sparkly. It's like, you know, glitter. And it also makes it sweeter and it gives it a crunch. If you go into a Starbucks or into a coffee shop and you get yourself a coffee at a social distance, put a few packets of sugar in the raw in your pocket. 2 packets are the perfect amount for topping your pie, because sanding sugar is incredibly expensive. It's like one of those strange things, you get a big amount and you never use it but once a month. It only takes a couple of those packets to do that. Pro
Now
tip.
you're suggesting people break the law. Great.
No, I said buy a coffee.
Okay, you did.
I said
did.
buy a
That's
coffee.
right. Can I mix here?
Now
or-
you're gonna continue mixing.
Okay.
I'm done with mine.
So, this has been resting much longer than it needs to, and it will show more signs of strength. We've already talked about that simply from sitting in an off environment. Can you see this over here, Ray? You'll see when I pull on it, instead of just shredding like it did before, it's got some structure. That's the, again, another fancy word. In this case, the word is autodese. So now, I'll go to more of a medium speed. This is the water that's been reserved, the 29 grams of water that I'll dribble in at the end. And this already looks like it's standing up pretty nicely.
Yeah, that is
So
quite
it's
a
pretty
difference.
strong.
Yeah.
So probably 2 minutes and this will be done.
You know what I think of autolies? My comparison is, you know, those they have bands that electrocute your stomach so that while you sit you can get abs. That's what it reminds me. They're infomercials where you don't have to exercise, just electrocute your belly while you're sitting watching television.
Why don't you just buy one of these instead of electrifying your abs?
I know, you just picked that up. And that is such a great little tool. I love it.
Okay, I'm going to dribble the water in now. It's not 100% strong enough, but I want to do this now because our timing is a little bit excessive today. We're a little late.
And so you had initially kept out, what was the percentage of water you kept out from
About 10% of the final dough water.
And that's the remaining water you're putting
Yep,
in.
and that just went in.
And that's to make that initial mix easier.
Yes,
for
you'll get
home
more
bakers.
strength with less time.
And then
If you figure that a wetter dough, there's less resistance. The hook
Right.
moving through the dough, there's less resistance.
Right.
So that translates into a delay in developing gluten.
right.
You could also finish this easily enough. The last few strokes you could simply do by hand.
And I'm interested in seeing you show us how you do a slightly wetter dough by hand, and that's where
A hand mix.
the bowl scraper and a good set of paws.
Yep. So it's incorporated evenly. You can see it's fairly loose with 2.5 hours of bulk fermentation. I guess this has 2 hours of bulk. This I would probably fold twice at 40-minute intervals instead of once after an hour.
So
just to give it that little extra dose of strength.
And when you look at many recipes, it won't say bulk fermentation, it will just say proof.
Yeah.
And it's just, bulk fermentation is when you're proofing that dough all together before you shape it. So it's all in bulk in one. And then
That's right.
once you shape it, you proof it again and make sure, some recipes say double, but I think it's really more feel.
It's feel and it's time. Yeah.
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 But that's also practice. But say you underproof a little, it's okay. You'll still have gorgeous bread. The crumb will just be a little tighter, and you will just get to know with practice. Because right now, I think this is a lovely time to practice these skills, get your hands in the dough, start feeling what all these things feel like. This is my little pie. I've decorated it and covered anything I found unsightly. And this is another thing that requires a little patience and making sure that you don't overwork the dough and really get a feel for what putting too much water feels like, what it feels like when it's too warm, and making sure that everything is going to come out of the oven beautifully and make you proud. But also, the process should be a joy.
It should be a joy. And, you know, back to the bread for a minute, those of you who do choose to make this bread, it's very, very tasty. But if you also have a sourdough, try it the way I mentioned earlier, where instead of making a yeasted pâte fermentée the evening before, make a sourdough the evening before. Don't put any yeast in. You'll have a different flavor, of course, but you'll have an equally tasty bread. And another thing I like to do when I'm at home, I prefer to make 4 loaves at a time.
Mm-hmm.
I can put 2 in the oven. I have a 30-inch home oven. But by making 4, I'll put 2 in the refrigerator right after shaping, and then pull them out whenever so that they're ready to go for the second round.
Yeah.
And I feel like I'm getting a better efficiency of BTUs for one thing,
Mm-hmm.
right? I'm not just heating the oven all the way up here just for one bake. I'm
Right.
getting more. And if I have 4 loaves, in all likelihood, I'm going to give at least a couple away, simply because that's another great joy,
Yeah.
to share the baked goods, right?
To share.
Yeah.
And when they come out of the oven, they are hot enough that you can be sure that they are safe, in that the icky virus does not survive that amount of heat. So then you put them on a cooling rack, and if you are going to give them away, get a clean piece of parchment to wrap them and wear gloves so that you can present them beautifully wrapped in parchment, and so that whomever you're gifting them to is secure in the knowledge that it is a beautiful bread that is safe to eat.
Do me a favor, since I'm a lefty.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Am I going to do it right in the middle? Right here?
Sure.
We never get to see what the inside of the bread looks like.
And this was one of the ones that I baked and brought today.
Yeah, so
It's
cool.
not the super hot one.
Oh, look at that gorgeousness. Look at all those seeds. This is such a delicious bread. Ray, how often have we been eating this? Every day for every meal? This makes me incredibly happy. So it will make you incredibly happy too if you bake this at home. It is incredibly delicious. I had a joy making it, love watching you make it, and I can't wait to see what we do tomorrow. What are you doing next week?
Next week, it's going to be a little bit of an oddball, curveball. I'm going to make pasta.
That's another hard thing to find in the grocery store is pasta.
Good.
Yeah.
We'll make pasta. I'll do some unfilled and some filled, and I'm going to be doing it with mostly durum flour, not semolina flour. Durum is the soft, floury milling of semolina is the
Yeah.
coarse, sandy bit, and durum is the flour. If you can't find durum and you want to make pasta, we'll talk next week about how you can just simply use all-purpose flour
Yeah.
and make a perfectly acceptable pasta.
Yeah.
We'll hand mix it, but I'm going to bring a KitchenAid overhead
Oh.
for some of the sheeting.
Great.
But we'll
And-
talk about hand rolling too. And
And-
what are you going to make?
I'm going to do what I promised I was going to do this week. I'm going to make the Mandlerhähnchen. So I'm going to do a little gluten. We're going to mix it up. I'm going to do some gluten-free stuff next week. You're going to be doing pasta. But that doesn't mean we're not going to be eating bread all week. Thank you, Jeffrey.
Thank you,
A joy
Gesine.
as usual.
Enjoy your week. Bake well.
Bake well. Stay safe. We're here for you as long as you need us to bake together apart.
Yeah, we're having a great time. Hope you are too.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
And we didn't even think once.